The morning fog rolled in from San Francisco Bay, wrapping around the Victorian houses of the Richmond district like a gray blanket that muffled the sounds of the awakening city. Margaret Maggie O'Sullivan stood at the wrought iron gates of St. Catherine's Children's Home, her weathered hands gripping the cold metal bars as she stared up at the imposing brick building that had housed orphan children for over 60 years. At 58, Maggie carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had weathered life's storms and emerged stronger, though not unscathed. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her navy wool coat, though well-maintained, showed signs of age and careful mending. The lines around her green eyes spoke of both laughter and sorrow, and her calloused hands revealed a lifetime of hard work. It had been 8 months since her husband Patrick had died suddenly of a heart attack while working in their small garden behind their Sunset District home. 8 months of rattling around in a house that felt too large and too quiet, surrounded by memories and an overwhelming sense that her life's purpose had ended along with his. The idea had come to her gradually, during the long nights when sleep eluded her and she found herself walking through rooms filled with the echoes of a 40-year marriage. She and Patrick had never been able to have children of their own, a source of quiet grief they had learned to carry together. Now, alone and searching for meaning, Maggie had decided she wanted to give a home to children who needed one. She pushed open the heavy wooden door of St. Catherine's and stepped into a lobby that smelled of industrial disinfectant and old linoleum. The walls were painted an institutional green that seemed designed to drain hope rather than inspire it. Behind a sliding glass window sat a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a nameplate that read Mrs. Dorothy Hennessy, Administrative Director. "Good morning," Maggie said, approaching the window with nervous energy. "I'd like to speak with someone about adopting a child, or perhaps fostering, if that's more appropriate." Mrs. Hennessy looked up from her paperwork without enthusiasm. "Do you have an appointment?" "No. I'm sorry. I was hoping someone might have a few minutes to speak with me. I've been thinking about this for months, and I finally worked up the courage to come in." Mrs. Hennessy sighed and consulted a large appointment book. "Sister Margaret isn't available until next Thursday, however. I can give you some preliminary information that might save you time." She pulled out a photocopied form and slid it through the window slot. "These are our basic requirements for prospective adoptive parents." Maggie accepted the form and began reading, her hope gradually deflating as she scanned the list. Age requirements. Both parents must be between 25 and 45 years old. Marital status. Married couples only, minimum 5 years. Income requirements. Combined household income of at least $75. Zero annually. "I see," Maggie said quietly, looking up from the form. "I'm 58, and I've recently been widowed. I suppose that eliminates me from consideration." Mrs. Hennessy's expression softened slightly. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. O'Sullivan." "Maggie O'Sullivan." "Mrs. O'Sullivan, I understand the desire to help children, but our policies exist for good reasons. Children need stability, and statistically, younger couples provide the best outcomes for adopted children. Have you considered volunteer work instead? We always need help with our weekend activities." Maggie folded the form carefully and placed it in her purse. "May I ask how many children are currently living here?" 43 children, ranging in age from 4 to 17. "Why do you ask? And how many are adopted each year?" Mrs. Hennessy shifted uncomfortably. "That varies. Last year we placed 8 children in permanent homes." 8 out of 43, Maggie repeated softly. "What happens to the others?" "They remain in our care until they age out of the system at 18. Mrs. O'Sullivan, I appreciate your concern, but our policies aren't arbitrary. They're based on decades of experience and state guidelines." Maggie stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Mrs. Hennessy, when you go home tonight to your family, 43 children will go to sleep in this building, most of them knowing they'll still be here when they turn 18. 8 children out of 43 found families last year. I may be 58 and widowed, but I have a large house, a teacher's pension, and 40 years of experience loving someone unconditionally. Are you certain that age and marital status are more important than a willingness to love?" Mrs. Hennessy looked uncomfortable but held firm. "I'm sorry, Mrs. O'Sullivan. The policies are clear." Outside, the fog had lifted slightly, revealing glimpses of the Golden Gate Bridge in the distance. Maggie walked slowly to her car, her mind churning with frustration and an emerging sense of determination. She had spent her career as an elementary school teacher, working with children from difficult backgrounds, and she knew the difference that one caring adult could make in a child's life. As she drove through the Richmond district, she noticed something she had never paid attention to before: the number of large, old houses that sat empty or were being converted into expensive condominiums. For young tech workers, Victorian mansions that had once housed large families now stood vacant, their potential wasted while children slept in institutional beds across the city. That evening, Maggie sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and a yellow legal pad. Something Patrick used to tease her about. When Maggie gets out the yellow pad, he would say, "She's about to change the world." She began making lists: her assets, her skills, her contacts from 40 years of teaching in the San Francisco public school system. She calculated her monthly pension, the equity in her house, and the small life insurance payout Patrick had left her. The numbers were modest, but not insignificant. On the second page, she wrote, "If they won't let me adopt one child, maybe I can help more than one." The idea was audacious and probably impossible, but as Maggie sat in her quiet kitchen, surrounded by the memory of Patrick's encouraging voice, it began to take shape. If the existing system couldn't see past her age and marital status to recognize her capacity to love and care for children, perhaps it was time to create a different kind of system. She pulled out the phone book and began researching licensing, requirements for residential care facilities, nonprofit organizations, and child welfare services. She called her sister Joan in Sacramento, who had worked as a social worker for 30 years. "Joan," Maggie said when her sister answered, hypothetically, "what would it take for someone to start a group home for children?" "Maggie O'Sullivan, what are you thinking?" Joan's voice carried both concern and familiarity with her sister's ambitious nature. "I went to St. Catherine's today to inquire about adoption. They turned me away because I'm too old and single. 43 children live there, Joan. Only 8 were adopted last year." Joan was quiet for a moment. "Starting a licensed group home is incredibly complex, Maggie. You need state licensing, background checks, facility inspections, trained staff, ongoing oversight, and the funding requirements alone would be staggering." "But is it possible?" Another pause. "Legally, yes. Practically, Maggie, you'd be taking on the state bureaucracy, existing institutions, and financial challenges that have defeated much larger organizations. Are you sure you want to do this just because one place turned you down?" Maggie looked around her kitchen, seeing Patrick's coffee mug still sitting on the counter where she couldn't bring herself to put it away. "Joan, I've spent 8 months feeling like my life ended when Patrick died. Today, for the first time since the funeral, I felt angry instead of sad. That has to count for something." Joan chuckled. "Well, anger has motivated you to do impossible things before. Remember when the school district tried to cut the arts program? I got them to restore funding and add a music teacher. And when the city wanted to tear down the playground at Golden Gate Park, we organized the neighborhood and saved it." Maggie felt a familiar fire stirring in her chest. "Joan, what if I could create a place where children aren't just warehoused until they age out? What if I could give them a real home?" "Then you'd better get a bigger legal pad," Joan said. "And you'd better be prepared for the fight of your life." After hanging up, Maggie walked through her house with new eyes. The 4-bedroom Victorian had been home to her and Patrick for 35 years. The mortgage was paid off, and while it needed some updating, it was structurally sound and filled with love. But more importantly, it was just one house on a street filled with similar properties. She stood in her front garden as the evening fog rolled back in from the bay, looking up and down her street at the houses where families had once thrived. Most were now occupied by single professionals or elderly couples whose children had moved away. The neighborhood had good schools, safe streets, and a strong sense of community. Everything children needed to thrive. An idea began forming that was even more ambitious than she had initially imagined. What if she didn't just start a group home, but created an entirely new model for caring for children? What if she could build a community where children weren't institutionalized, but were integrated into a neighborhood where they could experience real family life? That night, Maggie lay awake not with grief, but with excitement, her mind racing with possibilities. She thought about the children sleeping in their institutional beds at St. Catherine's, and about the dozens of other facilities throughout the Bay Area where children waited for families. That might never come. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of learning exactly what it would take to turn her impossible dream into reality. She would face bureaucrats, regulations, funding challenges, and probably years of setbacks and obstacles. But tonight, for the first time since Patrick's death, Maggie O'Sullivan felt truly alive. 3 weeks after her rejection at St. Catherine's, Maggie's dining room looked like a war room. The antique mahogany table that had hosted countless dinner parties was now covered with legal documents, state regulations, architectural blueprints, and financial spreadsheets. Yellow legal pads filled with her careful handwriting were stacked on every available surface, and the walls were covered with maps of San Francisco neighborhoods and photographs she had printed from real estate websites. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Maggie had spent every day since her visit to the orphanage immersing herself in the complex world of child welfare services, learning about licensing requirements, funding sources, and the labyrinthine bureaucracy that governed how children in need were cared for in California. Her first stop had been the San Francisco Department of Social Services, where she met with Carlos Mendoza, a caseworker who had been in the system for 15 years. Carlos was a soft-spoken man in his 40s with kind eyes that had seen too much, and he had been surprisingly encouraging when Maggie explained her vision. "Mrs. O'Sullivan," Carlos had said, leaning back in his chair in the cramped office he shared with 3 other social workers, "I place kids in group homes every week. Most of them are overcrowded, understaffed, and focused more on compliance than on actually helping children heal and grow. If you could create something different, something that actually puts children first, you'd have my support." He had given her a thick folder of regulations and requirements, warning her that the licensing process typically took 18 to 24 months and required significant upfront investment. "The state wants to see financial stability, trained staff, proper facilities, and a detailed operational plan before they'll even consider your application," he had explained. Maggie had left his office both intimidated and more determined than ever. Her second major appointment had been with Rebecca Chen, a nonprofit consultant who specialized in helping organizations navigate the startup process. Rebecca worked out of a small office in the Mission District, and her walls were covered with certificates and photos from the dozens of successful nonprofits she had helped establish. "Your vision is admirable," Rebecca had told her after reviewing Maggie's initial notes, "but you're talking about creating something that hasn't really been done before. Most group homes are designed to house 8 to 12 children in a single facility. You're proposing a network of smaller homes throughout a neighborhood, each housing 3 to 4 children with dedicated caregivers. It's innovative, but it's also going to be a bureaucratic nightmare." Rebecca had helped Maggie understand the financial realities of her dream. Initial startup costs would be substantial: property acquisition, renovation, licensing fees, staff salaries, insurance, and operating expenses for at least the first 2 years while they established credibility and secured ongoing funding. "You're looking at a minimum of $2 million just to get started," Rebecca had said bluntly. "Where's that money going to come from?" Maggie had left that meeting feeling overwhelmed but not defeated. She had a teacher's pension, the equity in her house, and Patrick's life insurance money, but that totaled less than $400,000, nowhere near what she would need. That's when she had called her old friend Father Michael Sullivan from St. Brendan's Catholic Church in the Sunset District. Father Mike, despite sharing her last name, was no relation, but he had been her and Patrick's priest for over 20 years. He was a practical man who understood both the spiritual and logistical challenges of helping people in need. "Maggie," Father Mike had said when she explained her plan over coffee in the church rectory, "you're talking about creating something beautiful, But you're also talking about taking on a system that's been in place for generations. Are you prepared for how difficult this is going to be? Mike, I've been teaching in public schools for 40 years. I've dealt with difficult systems before. Father Mike had smiled. Fair point. What do you need from me? Guidance. And maybe, could the church consider being a partner in this? Not financially, necessarily, but as a community anchor. Father Mike had been quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the neighborhood where both he and Maggie had invested their lives. Let me think about it, and let me talk to some people. There might be more support for this than you realize. Now, 3 weeks later, Maggie sat at her dining room table with a thick folder of information that Father Mike had compiled. He had quietly reached out to parishioners, community leaders, and other local churches, and the response had been surprising. The Sunset District had an aging population. Many longtime residents were empty nesters whose children had moved away, often to more affordable areas outside the Bay Area. Several families had expressed interest in the idea of opening their homes to children who needed families, but they had never known how to navigate the foster care system. More importantly, Father Mike had introduced Maggie to several potential allies. Dr. Sarah Kim, a pediatrician who ran a clinic serving low-income families, was interested in providing medical services. Robert Martinez, a retired contractor who had built half the renovations in the neighborhood over the past 30 years, had offered to help with property assessments and construction management. And most surprisingly, Margaret Wong, a successful businesswoman who had grown up in foster care herself, had expressed interest in providing significant financial backing. Maggie had met with Margaret the previous week at her office in downtown San Francisco. Margaret was in her 50s, impeccably dressed, and ran a successful marketing firm that specialized in tech startups. But when she talked about her childhood in the foster care system, her polished exterior revealed the vulnerability of someone who had never forgotten what it felt like to be unwanted. Mrs. O'Sullivan, Margaret had said, I aged out of the system when I was 18 with nothing but a garbage bag full of clothes and a bus ticket to nowhere. I've spent my entire adult life proving that I was worth something, but I've never forgotten the other kids who didn't make it out. If you can create a place where children actually get the love and support they need, I want to help make it happen. Margaret had committed to a substantial financial contribution and had connected Maggie with her attorney, David Park, who specialized in nonprofit law. David had spent hours helping Maggie understand the legal structure she would need to establish, the board of directors she would need to recruit, and the ongoing compliance requirements she would face. The good news, David had told her, is that your model addresses many of the problems that state regulators are concerned about. Smaller homes, lower child-to-caregiver ratios, community integration. These are all things the state wants to see more of. The challenge will be proving that you can maintain quality and oversight across multiple locations. As Maggie reviewed her notes from the past 3 weeks, she realized that her impossible dream was slowly becoming a feasible plan. She had identified 3 Victorian houses within 4 blocks of each other in the Sunset District that were for sale at reasonable prices. Each could be converted to house 3 to 4 children with a live-in caregiver and common areas for meals, homework, and family activities. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Joan, calling from Sacramento. Maggie, I've been doing some research on my end, Joan said without preamble. I talked to my supervisor about your idea, and she's intrigued. The state is actually looking for innovative models for residential care, especially ones that focus on smaller, more family-like environments. Really? There's a pilot program that provides additional funding for facilities that meet certain criteria: community integration, educational support, mental health services, and successful transition planning for kids aging out of the system. Your model could qualify. Maggie felt her heart racing. How much additional funding? Potentially enough to cover about 60% of your operating costs, if you can prove that your model produces better outcomes for children. After hanging up, Maggie walked to her kitchen window and looked out at her neighborhood with new eyes. The tree-lined streets, the corner grocery store where Mr. Kim had worked for 30 years, the elementary school where she had taught for 2 decades. This was a community where children could thrive. She thought about the 43 children sleeping at St. Catherine's tonight, and about the thousands of other children throughout California who were waiting for someone to see their potential instead of just their problems. Tomorrow, she would call Rebecca Chen and schedule a meeting to begin the formal process of establishing her nonprofit organization. She would start the paperwork for the pilot program Joan had mentioned. She would contact real estate agents about the 3 houses she had identified. But tonight, sitting in the kitchen where she and Patrick had dreamed together for so many years, Maggie felt his presence encouraging her forward. She picked up her pen and wrote at the top of a fresh legal pad, "Sunset Family Homes, where every child belongs." The bureaucrats at St. Catherine's had been wrong about one thing. Age and marital status weren't the most important qualifications for caring for children. What mattered was the willingness to fight for them, and Maggie O'Sullivan was just getting started. 6 months after her rejection at St. Catherine's, Maggie stood in the empty living room of 1247 Irving Street, her footsteps echoing off the hardwood floors that hadn't seen children's laughter in over a decade. The Victorian house, built in 1922, had good bones despite needing significant updates. Afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits of possibility. "The electrical needs to be completely redone," said Robert Martinez, her contractor friend, as he emerged from the basement with cobwebs in his hair and a flashlight in his hand. "And the plumbing is original to the house, which means it's held together with prayer and stubbornness." Maggie nodded, making notes on her ever-present legal pad. She had purchased the house 2 weeks earlier, using a significant portion of her savings as a down payment. The seller, an elderly woman who had inherited the property from her aunt, had been moved by Maggie's vision and had agreed to carry a second mortgage at below-market rates. "How much are we talking about for the renovations?" Maggie asked. Robert consulted his clipboard, where he had been calculating costs for the past hour. "To bring everything up to code for a residential care facility, plus the modifications you want for accessibility and safety features, I'd estimate around $80,000. The number hit Maggie like a physical blow. Even with Margaret Wong's generous contribution and the small grants she had secured from local foundations, money was tight. Every dollar spent on renovations was a dollar that wouldn't be available for operating expenses once they opened. "I know it's a lot," Robert said gently, seeing her expression, "but I've got some ideas about how we can reduce costs. I know guys who owe me favors, and I can get materials at cost through my connections. More importantly, I believe in what you're doing. I'm willing to work for cost plus a small profit margin instead of my usual rates." Maggie felt tears spring to her eyes. Over the past 6 months, she had been constantly amazed by the generosity of people who shared her vision of creating something better for children in need. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Sarah Kim. "Board meeting still on for tonight? I have updates from the Medical Licensing Committee." Maggie had established the board of directors for Sunset Family Homes 3 months earlier, recruiting a diverse group of professionals who brought different expertise to the organization. In addition to Dr. Kim, the board included Father Mike, Margaret Wong, Carlos Mendoza from Social Services, Rebecca Chen as nonprofit advisor, and Jana Rodriguez, a retired teacher who had spent her career working with at-risk youth. The board meetings were held in Father Mike's parish hall, and they had evolved from informal discussions to structured planning sessions. As the organization took shape, tonight's meeting would be crucial. They were expecting final word on their application for the state pilot program that Joan had told her about at 7 p.m. Maggie walked into the familiar parish hall to find her board members already deep in conversation. The room smelled of coffee and the dinner the parish had served earlier to homeless community members, and the walls were covered with children's artwork from the church's after-school program. "Maggie," Margaret Wong called out as she entered, "we need to talk about the timeline. I've been reviewing the financial projections, and we're cutting things very close." Dr. Kim looked up from a stack of medical forms. "The good news is that we've been approved to provide on-site medical services through my clinic. The state licensing board was impressed by our integrated approach to healthcare. Carlos Mendoza nodded approvingly. That's going to be a huge advantage. Most group homes struggle to provide adequate medical care because kids have to travel to different facilities for routine appointments. Father Mike stood up and moved to the front of the room. Before we get into the details, I have some news that might change our whole timeline. He paused dramatically. I got a call this afternoon from the state. We've been approved for the pilot program. The room erupted in celebration. But Father Mike held up his hand for quiet. There's more, because our model was rated so highly by the review committee. They're offering us full funding for startup costs in addition to the ongoing operational support. Maggie felt her knees go weak. What does that mean exactly? Rebecca Chen, who had been quiet until now, grinned broadly. It means you just got handed about $500,000 in startup funding, plus guaranteed operational support for the first 3 years. But, Carlos interjected, it also means increased oversight and higher expectations. The state is going to be watching everything we do very carefully because they want to use our model as a prototype for other communities. Margaret Wong pulled out her laptop and began typing quickly. This changes everything. With full startup funding, we can move forward much more aggressively. Instead of opening one house and proving the concept, we could potentially open all 3 houses simultaneously. Maggie sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. 6 months ago, she had been a lonely widow who was told she was too old to adopt a single child. Now she was on the verge of creating an entirely new model for caring for children that could potentially be replicated across the state. There's something else we need to discuss, Dr. Kim said. Gently, I've been contacted by several families in the neighborhood who want to get involved. The Johnsons on 22nd Avenue have expressed interest in becoming caregivers. The Patel family wants to provide tutoring services. And Mrs. Chen from the corner market has offered to donate groceries. Jeanne Rodriguez, who had been taking detailed notes, looked up with excitement. This is exactly what we hoped for. Community integration. These children won't just be living in the neighborhood. They'll be part of it. Father Mike nodded. I've also been approached by St. Monica's Lutheran Church and Temple Beth Shalom. They want to partner with us to provide mentorship programs and cultural activities. We're building something bigger than just a group home. We're creating a community that wraps around these children. As the meeting continued, Maggie found herself both exhilarated and terrified by the scope of what they were creating. They discussed hiring timelines, training programs for caregivers, partnerships with local schools, and the complex logistics of opening 3 homes while maintaining the intimate, family-like atmosphere that was central to their vision. We need to be very careful about how we select our first children, Carlos warned. The state is going to be evaluating our success based on outcomes, educational progress, behavioral improvements, successful transitions to independence or family reunification. We need kids who can benefit from our model, but who aren't so. I need that they set us up for failure. Maggie understood the practical wisdom in Carlos's advice, but it troubled her. Doesn't that mean we'd be cherry-picking the easier cases and leaving the most challenging children in the existing system? Not necessarily, Dr. Kim said thoughtfully. What it means is that we start with children who can help us prove the model works, and then we gradually expand to serve children with more complex needs. It's about building sustainable success. As the meeting wound down, Rebecca Chen pulled Maggie aside. You realize what you've accomplished here, don't you? 6 months ago, this was just an angry widow's impossible dream. Now you're about to launch a revolutionary program that could change how we care for children throughout California. Maggie looked around the parish hall, where her board members were engaged in animated discussions about paint colors, playground equipment, and staff training schedules. These people had become her extended family, united by a shared commitment to children who needed what she had needed 30 years ago. Someone who wouldn't give up on them, Rebecca. Maggie said quietly, I keep waiting for someone to tell me this is all a mistake, that I'm not qualified to do something this big. Rebecca smiled. Maggie, you spent 40 years teaching children that they could achieve more than anyone expected of them. Now you're about to prove the same thing about yourself. Later that evening, Maggie stood in her own kitchen, looking out at the neighborhood that was about to become home to children who had never had a real home before. She thought about the call she would make tomorrow to Mrs. Hennessy at St. Catherine's, not to gloat about her success, but to ask for her help in identifying children who might benefit from what Sunset Family Homes would offer. She picked up the phone and dialed a number she had called every week for the past 6 months. "Joan," she said when her sister answered, "you're never going to believe what happened today." "Let me guess," Joan replied with amusement in her voice. "You moved another mountain." "Something like that," Maggie said, and for the first time in over a year, she felt Patrick's presence not as a source of grief, but as a reminder that love creates ripples that extend far beyond what we can imagine. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of hiring staff, finalizing renovations, and preparing to welcome the first children to their new homes. Tonight, she would savor the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, when the world tells you that you're not enough, the right response is to prove them spectacularly wrong. 1 year and 2 days after Maggie O'Sullivan was turned away from St. Catherine's Children's Home, she stood on the front porch of 1247 Irving Street, watching a yellow school bus turn the corner onto her street. The morning fog was just beginning to lift, revealing the cheerful yellow paint and white trim of the Victorian house that had been transformed into the first Sunset Family Home. Behind her, the house hummed with quiet activity. In the kitchen, Maria Santos, the live-in caregiver Maggie had hired, was preparing after-school snacks and reviewing homework schedules. Maria was a bilingual former teacher in her 30s who had left traditional education to work more directly with children in need. Her warm laugh and patient demeanor had impressed everyone during the interview process. The renovations had been completed just 3 weeks earlier, transforming the old house into a warm, welcoming home that met all state requirements while maintaining the feel of a family residence. The living room featured comfortable couches, arranged around a fireplace, built-in bookshelves filled with age-appropriate books, and large windows that filled the space with natural light. The kitchen had been enlarged to include a breakfast nook where children could do homework while meals were prepared, and the dining room had been converted into a study space with individual desks and a computer station. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms had been thoughtfully designed for the children who would call this place home. Each room was painted in warm, welcoming colors and furnished with sturdy, child-friendly furniture. The largest room was designed to be shared by siblings, with bunk beds and separate storage areas that allowed children to maintain their individual identities while staying together. Maggie's hands trembled slightly as she watched the school bus approach. Today, Sunset Family Homes would welcome its first 3 residents, siblings Carlos and Elena Rodriguez, ages 8 and 10, and 12-year-old Jason Mitchell. All 3 children had been carefully selected by a committee that included Carlos Mendoza, Dr. Kim, and 2 other social workers who understood both the children's needs and the importance of this pilot program's success. Carlos and Elena had been in foster care for 2 years after their mother died in a car accident, and no relatives could be found to care for them. They had been placed in 3 different homes, never able to stay together until now. Jason had aged out of adoptable years and had been living in a group home that housed 14 boys. In a converted warehouse, he was bright, articulate, and angry, a combination that had made him challenging for traditional placements, but perfect for what Maggie hoped to accomplish. The bus pulled to a stop in front of the house, and Maggie felt her heart racing. As the door opened, Carlos Mendoza emerged first, followed by a woman Maggie didn't recognize, presumably the social worker from the children's previous placements. Then came the children. Carlos Rodriguez was small for his 8 years, with serious dark eyes that seemed too old for his face. He carried a worn backpack and held tightly to a stuffed animal that had clearly seen better days. His sister Elena was tall and lanky, with her mother's cheekbones and a protective stance that suggested she had been taking care of her little brother for longer than she should have had to. Jason Mitchell emerged last, a weary 12-year-old with sandy hair and blue eyes that held a mixture of hope and skepticism. He surveyed the house and the neighborhood with the careful assessment of someone who had learned not to get too attached to places that might be temporary. "Mrs. O'Sullivan," Carlos Mendoza called out as the group approached the porch. "I'd like you to meet Carlos, Elena, and Jason. Kids, this is Mrs. O'Sullivan. She's the person who made this house possible." Maggie knelt down to Carlos's eye level, noting how he instinctively moved closer to his sister. "Hi, Carlos. I'm Maggie. Welcome to your new home." Carlos nodded solemnly but didn't speak. Elena stepped slightly forward, her protective instincts engaged. "Is it really true that we get to stay together?" she asked, her voice carrying the weight of too many broken promises. "It's really true," Maggie said firmly. "You and Carlos will never be separated again while you're here. That's a promise." Jason hung back slightly, his posture defensive. "How long do kids usually stay here?" he asked. Maggie stood and looked directly at Jason, recognizing the fear behind his bravado. "That depends on what each child needs. Some children will reunite with family members when that becomes possible. Others might find adoptive families, and some might choose to stay here until they're ready to live independently as adults. What matters is that this is your home for as long as you need it." Maria Santos appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. "Who's ready to see their rooms?" she asked with a warm smile. The tour of the house was a revelation for all three children. Carlos and Elena marveled at their shared room, with its twin beds, individual dressers, and window seat overlooking the garden. Jason examined his private room with careful attention, testing the desk chair, examining the bookshelf, and opening the closet to assess the storage space. "This is really mine?" Jason asked quietly. "It's really yours," Maria confirmed. "You can decorate it however you want, and everything in it belongs to you." In the kitchen, Dr. Kim was waiting with a warm smile and a medical bag. "I'm Dr. Kim," she said, "and I'll be your doctor while you live here. I have an office just a few blocks away, but I also come here for regular checkups so you don't have to miss school for medical appointments." Elena looked suspicious. "Are you going to give us shots?" Dr. Kim laughed. "Only if you need them to stay healthy, mostly. I'm here to make sure you're growing well and feeling good. And if you ever get sick or hurt, I'm the person who will take care of you." As the afternoon progressed, Maggie watched the children begin to cautiously explore their new environment. Carlos discovered the art supplies in the living room and began drawing quietly at the coffee table. Elena found the kitchen fascinating and asked Maria if she could help prepare dinner. Jason gravitated toward the computer station and began researching the neighborhood, mapping out walking routes to school, and identifying the location of the library and local parks. Father Mike arrived at dinner time, not in his clerical collar, but dressed casually in jeans and a sweater. "I live just around the corner," he explained to the children, "and I like to stop by and see how everyone is doing. I also make pretty good pancakes, if anyone is interested in weekend breakfast cooking lessons." Carlos looked up from his drawing for the first time since arriving. "I like pancakes," he said softly. "Then we'll have to cook some together soon." Father Mike replied. Dinner was a quiet affair, but not uncomfortably so. Maria had prepared a simple meal of spaghetti and meatballs, and the children ate with the careful manners of those who had learned that good behavior might mean the difference between staying and being moved again. "Tomorrow," Maria said as she served dessert, homemade chocolate chip cookies that filled the house with the smell of vanilla and butter. "We'll go shopping for anything you need for your rooms. And this weekend, we'll explore the neighborhood, so you can see where everything is." Jason looked up from his cookie. "Are we allowed to walk around by ourselves, within certain boundaries?" "Yes," Maggie said. "This is your neighborhood now, and I want you to feel comfortable here. We'll talk about the rules and expectations, but they're designed to keep you safe, not to control you." Elena had been quiet through most of dinner, but now she spoke up. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, what if we do something wrong? What if we don't fit in here?" Maggie set down her coffee cup and looked at each child in turn. "Elena, Carlos, Jason, you're not here on probation. You're here because this is your home. Everyone makes mistakes. Everyone has bad days, and everyone needs time to adjust to new situations. What matters is that we work through problems together, as a family. Carlos looked up from his drawing, which Maggie could now see was a picture of the house with 3 small figures standing in front of it. "Are you our mom now?" he asked. The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of loss and hope. Maggie felt tears spring to her eyes as she considered how to answer. "I'm not your mom," she said gently. "Your mom will always be your mom, and no one can replace her. But I'm someone who loves you and wants to take care of you. Some kids call me Maggie, some call me Mrs. O'Sullivan. You can call me whatever feels right to you." After dinner, as Maria helped the children settle into their nighttime routines, Maggie stepped outside onto the front porch. The fog had rolled back in from the bay, wrapping the neighborhood in its familiar embrace. Lights glowed warmly in the windows of houses up and down the street, and she could hear the distant sound of families going about their evening routines. Dr. Kim joined her on the porch, having stayed to observe the children's first day and assess how they were adjusting. "How do you think it went?" Maggie asked. "Better than I expected," Dr. Kim replied. "They're cautious, which is appropriate, but they're not shut down. Carlos is going to need some time to process his trauma, and Elena is carrying too much responsibility for her age, but those are things we can work on. Jason is testing boundaries, which is also normal." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the sounds of the house behind them. Maria's voice encouraging Carlos to brush his teeth, Elena asking if she could keep her bedroom door open, Jason questioning whether the house had a security system. "You know," Dr. Kim said eventually, "when you first presented this idea to the board, I thought it was ambitious but probably impossible. Watching those children tonight, seeing them begin to relax and trust, I think you might have actually done it." "Done what?" "Created a place where children can heal." Over the following weeks, Maggie watched as the 3 children gradually settled into the rhythms of their new life. Carlos began speaking more, especially to Maria, who had a gift for drawing him out with art projects and cooking activities. Elena slowly relinquished some of her protective vigilance over her brother, as she realized that the adults in the house were trustworthy and competent. Jason tested every rule and boundary, but he did so with decreasing intensity as it became clear that consequences were consistent, but not punitive. The neighborhood embraced the children in ways that surprised even Maggie. Mrs. Chen from the corner market began stocking the snacks they liked, and always had a friendly word when they came in with Maria. The Patel family invited Elena to join their daughter's study group, and Carlos discovered that Mr. Johnson down the street was an amateur magician who was happy to teach card tricks to interested students. 6 weeks after opening, Maggie received a call that changed everything. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, this is Dorothy Hennessy from St. Catherine's Children's Home," the familiar voice said. "I hope you remember me." Maggie felt her heart skip a beat. "Of course, Mrs. Hennessy. How can I help you?" "I'm calling because I owe you an apology. I've been following the coverage of your pilot program in the social services newsletters, and I've heard remarkable things about what you've accomplished." Maggie was too surprised to respond immediately. Mrs. Hennessy continued, "More importantly, we have a situation here that I think might benefit from your approach. We have siblings, 3 children, ages 6, 9, and 14, who have been with us for 8 months. Multiple families have inquired about adopting the younger 2, but no one wants all 3. The oldest boy is challenging, and families are intimidated by the prospect of taking on a teenager along with younger children." "What are you asking me, Mrs. Hennessy?" "I'm asking if Sunset Family Homes might consider taking them. I know your first house is full, but I understand you're planning to open additional homes. These children need what you're providing, a place where they can stay together and get individual attention." Maggie looked out her kitchen window at the house, where Carlos was teaching Jason to ride a bicycle while Elena cheered them on. From the front steps, Maria was in the garden with Dr. Kim, discussing the therapeutic benefits of gardening for children who had experienced trauma. "Send me their files," Maggie said. "I can't make any promises, but we can certainly evaluate whether we might be a good fit for them." 3 months later, the second Sunset Family Home opened at 1889 Judah Street, just 6 blocks from the original house. the three siblings from St. Catharines, David, Maria, and little Antonio, moved in with caregiver couple Sarah and James Chen, a bilingual team who specialized in working with children who had experienced severe trauma. The third house opened 6 months after that, and by the end of its second year, Sunset Family Homes was caring for 12 children across 3 homes. More importantly, the pilot program had exceeded every metric the state had established for success. Children were excelling academically, behavioral issues were minimal, and the community integration model was being studied by child welfare agencies across the country. Maggie found herself invited to speak at conferences, consulted by other communities wanting to replicate the model, and featured in news articles about innovative approaches to child welfare. But her favorite moments were still the small, daily ones, watching Carlos proudly display his artwork on the refrigerator, celebrating Elena's Strata report card, or seeing Jason mentor newer residents with the same patience and kindness he had received. On the second anniversary of opening day, Maggie stood on the same front porch where she had first welcomed 3 scared children. The yellow school bus was approaching again, but this time it carried children coming home from school to a place where they knew they belonged. Jason, now 14 and one of the program's greatest success stories, bounded up the front steps with his backpack and a soccer ball. "Hey, Maggie," he called out, using the name he had settled on after trying several variations. "Guess what? I got accepted to the summer engineering program at SF State, and my social worker thinks I might be ready to start talking about independent living skills training." Maggie felt the familiar mix of pride and protective sadness that came with watching children grow up and prepare to leave the nest. "That's wonderful, Jason. Are you excited about it?" "Yeah," he said, then paused, but also kind of scared. "I mean, this is the first place I've ever lived that actually felt like home. What if I'm not ready to be on my own?" Maggie put her arm around his shoulders. "Jason, you know that graduating from our program doesn't mean losing your family here. You'll always have a place at this table, and we'll always be here to support you. That's what families do." Inside the house, she could hear the sounds of children arriving home from school, backpacks hitting the floor, refrigerator doors opening, voices calling out to Maria about homework questions and after-school plans. It was the chaotic, beautiful noise of a family, and it filled the spaces in Maggie's heart that had been empty for so long. That evening, as she sat in her own kitchen reviewing applications from other communities that wanted to start their own Sunset Family Homes programs, Maggie reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 2 years ago, she had been a lonely widow who was told she was too old and unqualified to care for a single child. Now, she was the founder of a program that had provided stable, loving homes for dozens of children and was being replicated in communities across 3 states. More importantly, she had discovered that sometimes the most profound healing comes not from getting what we think we want, but from giving what we have to offer. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Margaret Wong, calling from her office where she was working late on a new expansion proposal. "Maggie," Margaret said, excitement clear in her voice, "I just got off the phone with the Department of Health and Human Services in Washington. They want to fund a national study of our model, with the goal of potentially implementing it in 25 cities over the next 5 years." Maggie set down her pen and looked out at the neighborhood that had embraced her vision and helped make it reality. "Margaret, 2 years ago I just wanted to adopt one child. How did we get here?" Margaret laughed. "We got here because you refused to accept no as a final answer, and because you understood something that the bureaucrats at St. Catharines didn't, that love and determination matter more than age or marital status when it comes to caring for children." After hanging up, Maggie walked through her house, turning off lights and checking that doors were locked. In the living room, she paused in front of the mantel where Patrick's photo still sat, now surrounded by pictures of all the children who had found homes through Sunset Family Homes. "We did it, Patrick," she whispered to his smiling image. "We proved them wrong." Outside, the fog was rolling in from the bay as it did every evening, but inside the houses scattered throughout the Sunset District, Children who had once been considered unwanted were falling asleep in beds they could call their own, in rooms they had decorated themselves, in homes where they knew they were loved. And in her kitchen, a 60-year-old widow who had been told she had nothing to offer was planning how to help even more children find their way home. The woman who had been turned away from the orphanage had indeed built something better. Not just new buildings, but a new understanding of what family could mean and what was possible when communities came together to care for their most vulnerable members. Sometimes the most important revolutions begin with a single person who refuses to accept that the way things are is the way they have to be. Sometimes the most profound changes come from the simplest recognition that every child deserves a place to belong. And sometimes the people who change the world are the ones who were told they weren't qualified to make a difference at all.